Are you my coffee? Because you're the first thing I think about in the morning. Happy Thursday, everybody. I'm Brian, and this is the morning report for the federal courts for September 4th, 2025. Double tap your screen, leave me a comment, try to watch a little, even if you're coming back later. Check out the link in my bio to help keep this sustainable. All right, let's get to the news, shall we? First, at the risk of spending too much time on this case this week, it was a pretty big deal, so just a couple quick things about Newsom v. Trump. After the opinion came out yesterday, California immediately filed for a new preliminary injunction asking the court to return control of the National Guard to California and its governor. The argument is that Donald Trump's original reason for sending out the troops was in response to civil unrest, which no longer exists. Without that reason, there's no excuse for keeping the military in place except to perform routine law enforcement activities, which the court has now determined violate posse comitatus. But the federal government has put in a second order to extend the National Guard term for another 90 days, which California says is against the court's order. Of course, the problem is the court's order doesn't go into effect until a week from this Friday, so even if the court wanted to do something in theory, it's sort of stuck until then. Meanwhile, California has also requested that this be dealt with on an expedited schedule. And I'm mentioning that because it's kind of a unique theory. So California is going to have a special election soon, and the deployment is expected to last just past Election Day. California has asked to hurry up this process so that the deployment does not chill voter turnout in the upcoming special election. California quotes President Trump as saying he wanted the military to, quote, handle last year's national election and save the election from radical left lunatics. So there is a potential nexus between the military presence and election interference. California also points to the Department of Defense long-standing policy to, quote, avoid the possibility or perception of voter coercion or intimidation by military personnel, or a military presence, or even the perception that the military has authority over the election process. But unsurprisingly, the federal government wasted no time in filing an appeal of the decision on Tuesday to the Ninth Circuit. So if the Ninth Circuit decides to stay the district court's decision while it works this all out, it'll be out of the hand of the judge anyway, so All right, what do we got next? Abramowitz v. Lake. This is a case about the dismantling of Voice of America and the attempt by Kari Lake to fire its director, Michael Abramowitz. Last week, the court granted Mr. Abramowitz's motion for a partial summary judgment, essentially stating that he could not be fired except by the advisory board as stated in the law. As we've come to expect, the government immediately filed an appeal and a request for a stay pending the appeal. But yesterday, the court denied that request for a stay, finding that the government is unlikely to succeed on the merits of the case. The government's main argument here is that the president has the power under Article 2 to basically fire anybody he wants, even when Congress wrote a very specific law saying the person can only be fired by this advisory board. But throwing both the text of the Constitution and a little shade back in the DOJ's face, the judge said, and I quote here, "The defendants come back to this court beating the dead horse that requiring the approval of the board constitutes a dramatic interference with the president's power to remove Abramowitz. And in doing so, they continue to ignore the text of the Constitution itself, which provides that the appointment, and therefore removal, of inferior officers, like Mr. Abramowitz, is emphatically not the sole province of the president. Rather," and here the judge quotes Article 2, Section 2, "Congress may, by law, vest the appointment of such inferior officers as they think proper in the president alone, or in the courts of law, or in the heads of the departments," end quote. So the stay was denied, and Mr. Abramowitz stays at the helm. Okay, next. This one I think you're really going to enjoy. This is Center for Taxpayer Rights v. IRS. Don't let the name fool you. This is a really interesting look inside of a case and sort of what's going on inside of a judge's head. So Center for Taxpayer Rights is suing the IRS for signing an agreement to create an information sharing situation with ICE. Yeah. So in other words, they're sharing taxpayer data with immigration enforcement. And yesterday, the court issued this series of questions that it wants answers to. And basically, at the next hearing, it wants the parties to walk in ready to answer these questions. And honestly, this may seem really sensible, but you don't usually see something like this. Usually the two sides sort of argue back and forth and demand things from each other. And sometimes the judge will ask for something during a hearing, but they don't usually line it up in advance like this. This is pretty out of the ordinary, so I wanted to share it. Now, this is Judge Colleen Kolar-Kotelly, and I am kind of a fan of hers. She was both a Reagan and a Clinton appointee, so she's been on the bench since I was 5 years old. She is kind of a badass. I read an opinion of hers last Friday. She is great. Anyway, so the first question she asks is, so the agreement that IRS and ICE signed said that the details of their information exchange would be laid out in a separate agreement. And the court asks, did the IRS enter into a separate agreement? And if so, tell me about it. Okay. Second, the court says that on June 27th, ICE requested information for about 1.28 million people from the IRS, and the court wants to know what the IRS's understanding was of how ICE came up with that list of names. Third, there are laws that restrict when the IRS is allowed to release information about individuals, even to law enforcement. And on August 7th, the IRS did release information on about 47,000 people. And the court says, did the IRS comply with those laws? So, for example, the IRS is only allowed to release your information to law enforcement if the agency attaches the specific statute that they're investigating you for along with your name. How did the IRS track all of that and make sure that every single name had an appropriate statute attached? Fourth, there was a request for a preliminary injunction in May in a different case, but a case that was also about the same IRS-ICE agreement. But the injunction was denied because the judge in that case held that the agreement didn't specifically violate those laws we just talked about. It was possible to follow both the agreement and the law. But now, the judge would like to know, did you actually comply with all those laws, or should that injunction have been issued? And finally, the court asks, I love this, okay, so now we're here. If you have violated the law, now there's a request in this case for an injunction. What do you recommend I do? Which is kind of a crazy thing for her to ask, right? Like, this other judge denied the injunction because there was no evidence you'd violate the law. So if you went ahead and violated the law anyway and will continue to violate the law, what else should I do at this point other than approve the injunction? What do you recommend, government? Any thoughts? I absolutely love this lady. I think she's just awesome. Anyway, okay. Last case. There were several similar cases that were all in response to a Trump administration executive order that ordered removal of any reference to DEI or so-called woke language. And among the problems that came with that order, a lot of stuff was taken down or taken away that was really important and somewhat unrelated to even the intended purpose of the order. So cases like Washington State Medical Association v. Kennedy and Doctors for America were groups of physicians and other healthcare providers that relied on medical information that came out of the CDC, NIH, HHS, and other government sites, information that doctors needed to keep their patients healthy. But suddenly, because there was a reference to a no-no word, the entire site just disappeared with no warning, and they had some pretty major impacts around the country. So these cases are generally starting to come out in favor of the healthcare providers. Doctors for America closed out a couple weeks ago. The government's been restoring information on these websites, and it looks like the administration has finally realized that this is probably not a battle worth fighting. So in Washington State Medical Association, they just threw in the towel, and yesterday the government agreed to put all of the information back up. So I think this is objectively good news. I honestly have zero idea what this information is. I've read the complaints and the statements of the doctors, but they are super qualified physicians working in high-stress jobs in difficult places. They say they need this stuff. I am not going to argue with them. You have whatever you want, doctor. So I think this is pretty good news to start your morning with, and I hope you agree. All right, that is your Thursday morning report on the past day in the federal courts. Again, if you consider helping me sustain this, I would appreciate it. Check out the link in my bio, but either way, keep watching. Follow me on YouTube. Tell your friends. Thanks a lot, everybody, and have an amazing Thursday.